Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Developing Effective Procedures. Please make sure to look out for an email after the webinar containing the slides as well as information to register for our next webinar. Our presenters today will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask these questions throughout the webinar in the Questions tab on your side on GoToWebinar. Any questions we do not get to, Connects will provide those to the speaker, and we will be distributing the entire list after the webinar to all attendees. Lastly, you will see a number of materials in your handout section on the right side. These handouts include upcoming Connects conference agendas. We will also include the slides for the presentation. If you have any technical issues, please send a text in the chat tab in the GoToWebinar platform or call GoToWebinar directly at 888-646-0014. My name is John Tochi, and I manage partnerships for Connects. Connects is a leading educational partner showcasing innovative processes and technology for the GMP and validation environments. I'm happy to be here with you for this fifth webinar in CAI's U.S. Ops Readiness Series. Our inaugural Biopharma Manufacturing University Conference is coming up in November and will provide tremendous content of real-world case studies and industry insights as to how the biopharma manufacturing industry can transform for a better future. I'd also like to mention Connects' Computer Systems Validation and Software Assurance Conference coming up in December, which showcases over 40+ tutorials addressing today's top challenges for CSV, SA, and data integrity. Today's partner, I would like to take a minute to provide a little background. CAI originated almost 25 years ago in 1996 with only 2 employees. Fast forward to today, and now CAI is an employee-owned company with more than 500 employees at locations all over the world. CAI strives to be a trusted partner to their clients through their offerings in a number of different areas, which include commissioning and qualification, building commissioning, process and manufacturing technologies, quality compliance and regulatory, human performance asset management, reliability, program and project management, data center commissioning. If you'd like to learn more about CAI or inquire about their services, you can visit their website at www.cagents.com. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jeff Hall and Lisa Hawkins. Jeff Hall is an Associate Director in Human Performance Services with over 30 years of experience with implementing programs to support the startup, operation, and maintenance of process systems and equipment. He has over 20 years of experience managing projects up to 125 million and leading groups of people ranging from 1 to over 25 persons. Jeff has an MBA and is an expert in training development and project management. Uses the skills in these 2 areas to manage project costs and efficiency. He has used this approach to create focused, effective, and efficient organizations and successful project implementation. His experience in auditing and developing programs and lean projects in GMP, ELP, and GCP environments. Lisa Hawkins is a principal consultant specializing in quality, compliance, and regulatory affairs. Ms. Hawkins has 35 years of experience in quality assurance and regulatory affairs in all phases of development and manufacturing of life sciences products, including prescription, OTC pharmaceuticals, medical devices, dietary supplements, allopathic medicines, cosmetics, and functional food. She has created and implemented PCR processes from the ground up in multiple companies. Has worked to streamline, integrate new requirements, and improve compliance in other systems. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and we can start.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this week. This is a webinar that's part of our continuing series associated with operational readiness. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay. Today we're going to talk about writing smart procedures and how to make sure that they're effective and useful. Provide a little background on procedures and a little context of what we've seen as industry best practices, which, as we all know, changes periodically, and the approach that we're seeing right now most often used for writing procedures. I'm going to start off with a slide that we've shared pretty much in every one of our series, because what we really want to focus on is a lot of times when you get into the startup mode and you're in project mode, how do you get from project mode to run mode? And when you're talking about writing SOPs, it's extremely important that you start that process as soon as you can. Too often we work with people, or I have worked for companies where they get from project mode, they're ready to go to run mode, and oh shoot, we haven't written our procedures yet. And then they have to bring in an organization with several qualified people to write those procedures, and they get done in a hurry, and typically they're not adequate. And we'll talk about what that leads to in just a minute. So this is kind of a busy page that shows the different processes that we look at to help manage the control of risk for consistent quality and compliant manufacturing. When you look at this, probably the most important part of it is the quality systems control part at the bottom, where you talk about the people, the recipe, and the equipment. So no matter what you do in our industry, and what you do in any industry, it always comes down to people, so personnel variability, processes, and then the systems and equipment that you use for those processes. So today we're going to spend a little time talking about planning for and creating foundational structures for writing procedures. We need to create the documents so that they have the information that's contained in one primary procedure typically, and we'll talk about the hierarchy in a few minutes. And then this is referenced throughout the system. You're going to see how to create a basic structure for the procedures, what we see the most and what we use actually internally. You'll hear about assigning correct responsible groups. So there's it's interesting to see when people write procedures, the different types of people that are involved with writing those procedures, and they're not always the right ones. You'll hear who should be writing the documents and who should not. And then what should be included in each of the documents and what should not, some of the things that we've seen. You'll learn how to reduce your document proliferation by systematically creating documents, and this is my favorite part, not creating documents based on a reactionary approach. Create what you need, not what someone's telling you to react to. So, why do we care about procedures? I'm guessing most people here are from the pharma and biotech industry. In our industry, we care about procedures because someone tells us we have to care about procedures. We have the FDA. CFRs say you shall have procedures. And it tells you basically how those procedures should be structured. Another example is ICHQ7. So looking at what that requires for procedures, and these are just two really small examples. If you look at just ICHQ7, for example, it mentions procedures over 83 times in that document. So procedures are fundamental to what we do. But is this why we really want to write procedures? Yeah, it's a legal requirement, but at the end of the day, it's really about the people and the processes. We want to make sure that the products we make are consistent and safe for the people that we're making the products for. And that is about making sure the people have the tools to perform those processes. And these procedures are a key part of it. So just some background information. I wrote a blog a little while back that talked about this. It's interesting to see what the #1 observation is during an FDA inspection. And year after year, it's the same. So why is it the procedures is one of the most cited issues by the FDA? Well, that's a good question. In my 20-year career, just in this industry, and I spent 20 years in nuclear industry before this, procedures have been required for everything we've done. It's just a part and a way of life, part of our life working in this type of environment. So here's the data. I looked back to 2006, and I looked at the overall observations that were in drug products, and the reference for this is at the bottom of the slide. And I looked at medical devices. And the #1 observation every time was related to procedures. Nobody seemed to struggle to write good procedures. And I think a lot of it goes back to what I said at the beginning. It's about somehow they become an afterthought, and you get in such a big hurry that you don't write a good procedure. If we could figure this out, this would be such an easy win in eliminating FDA findings for us. And those findings cost companies money, but they also are clear that the operators and people on the floor don't have what they need to have. But if you look at the data here, in almost every one of these cases, 20% or more of the observations are related to writing procedures. So some of the common issues that were cited from writing procedures, when you're creating and implementing the procedures, the issues just repeat themselves over and over. I am amazed because, like I said, I've been in the industry since 2001. And even today, I can go into a plant, brand new plant that's hired experienced people, and I still see the same common issues that occur. Procedures are not in writing or fully followed. So either somebody's on the floor operating without a procedure, or the one that they have, they're not following. And there's many reasons for that, a couple of which we'll talk about shortly. Lack of or inadequate procedures. Again, these come right out of those findings from the graphs I just showed you. These are the things that they are citing. Lack of adequate or inadequate complaint procedures. So consistently over the last 15 years, because that's the data I have, these are the top findings. It's amazing because it's not just the top procedure findings, it's the top overall findings for both drugs and devices. So what are some indications of poorly written procedures? I know a lot of companies think they write good procedures. I've seen some good procedures. I've seen some procedures that obviously needed improvement. Typically ones that need help include SOPs that are 100 pages long. So let me say that again. An SOP, standard operating procedure, that is 100 pages long. So here I am, a lone technician, operator on the floor, trying to do my job the best I can, and there's a task somewhere in those 100 pages that I need to find to be able to perform. 100 pages, and I've seen quite a bit of that lately, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that occurs. There's information in the procedures that's not relevant to what they're doing. It's not relevant to their job. The procedures should be concise. They should be associated with the work that they're doing in their specific area and their specific job role to make sure that they can do it the right way. This is a huge one. I saw this a lot early in my career. Double-digit revisions in a short period of time. That's just an indicator. So that's an indicator that the procedures are not really being written adequately to start with, and that they're having to be reviewed over and over. There's constant findings that require you to revise the procedures. Regulatory agencies come in and they say, hey, your procedures are not adequate, and so now you're reacting to them and revising procedures. This is like anything else. You have to do some of the work up front to prevent issues in the long term. But when I see Rev 20 and you've been in operations for 2 years, I've got to scratch my head and say, why? A lot of the gaps that we see with procedures, and this is actually associated with one of the next higher level findings for the FDA, is training. So no hands-on training for the procedures. People want to use, and this is a separate topic in itself, people want to use the read and understand approach to SOPs. So if I was in a room with you and I could see all of you right now, I would ask you to raise your hands and say, how many of you think that you could remember everything that's in a 100-page procedure when you got on the floor? How many people do you think could read that procedure and afterwards take a test or an assessment where you can't use the procedure to test your knowledge and you think you would pass? I'll tell you right now, I wouldn't. Not for a 100-page procedure. Not for a 50-page procedure. There are a lot of the things that we do in those procedures that are critical operations or critical tasks that you can't just get from reading the document. So what we do is we create an environment basically telling operators and technicians to take shortcuts or create unapproved procedures because they can't follow the ones that are written. And that leads to deviations and CAPAs. In some cases, some of the batches of the drugs that we make have to go into quarantine or they have to be destroyed. So I'm going to come back to where I started here. If you were an operator on the floor, pushed to make deadlines, Could you find the steps you need to perform in a 100-page procedure? I'll bet any of us would be challenged with being able to do that. So what does a good procedure look like? Well, before you can actually get to what a good procedure looks like, you have to really look at who's writing your procedures. And I'm pretty sure most of you have probably seen something like this. So most of the time it's a tired and overworked what? That means that that person has a full-time job, and while they're doing that full-time job, they're being asked to write these procedures and do them in an effective and efficient way to make sure that they're accurate. A lot of roles involved there. Sometimes you get things from the OEM. Most of the time when you get something from the OEM, it's written in a general nature that applies to everybody who uses their product, not necessarily your company or your process. Engineers. Engineers are my favorite. So I'm an engineering guy. I've been in the industry for a while. I was in engineering on submarines for 20 years when I worked in nuclear power. Engineers are smart, but they don't always write the best procedures. They don't write the procedures at necessarily the right level. Subject matter experts. Again, those are people who probably have a full-time job and now they're being asked to write procedures as well. Validation. Validation typically doesn't get a whole lot in writing like SOPs. Obviously, they get involved in protocols and other things like that, but those are inputs to those SOPs. Random people that you've hired that cannot go to work in any other area right now, so you sit them in a room, you give them a list, and you say, write these. And they've never seen the equipment or the process before. Operators. That's actually not a bad selection, so long as they have the time to focus on writing the procedures correctly, because those are your end users. Maintenance is the same thing. Maintenance technicians, your leads, even some of your supervisors, those are good people to write procedures. But again, they're probably not doing it as a full-time exercise. They're probably having to do it after they're done with their day job. So in essence, we all write procedures, every one of us. So I have to mention here, Lisa, my colleague, mentioned that quality is not on this list. And I have to say I left quality off the list because quality is involved with the procedures through the whole process, or at least they should be. But to her point that she made to me, a lot of times quality ends up writing procedures for things that they've never seen. So who should write procedures? What are the right skills? What are the right experience that you need to have for writing procedures? So it should be somebody who's a subject matter expert. They're on that list, but it should be somebody who has the time to do it the right way. The subject matter experts could be your system owners. They could be your process engineers. Most likely, there's some of those people who are working on the floor. Most likely, there's some of your maintenance and facilities staff. Got to have good technical writing skills. That's a must. If you can't write the procedure where someone can follow it, then that's a challenge. If you can't use a template and fill it in correctly, that's a challenge. So you certainly need to have the technical writing skills. And you need the perspective of the end user. So if I were to look at this list, they're all important, but that last one is probably the most important. When I talked about the engineers before, engineers are smart. They help get everything in place, they get everything set up, validated, operating, but they often don't operate the equipment, so they don't look at it from the perspective of an end user. I can tell you, I'll give you kind of an old sea story. Years ago, I was working on with a squadron, part of submarines, and they were building a brand new class of submarine. One of the most important things they did was they took maintenance and operators down to the submarine in a mock-up when they were building it and said, this is how we're going to build it. Does that work for you? And if the answer was no, then they redesigned it and then they wrote the procedures for it. So they went through that process first. So whenever you're writing an SOP, a policy, a procedure, or work instruction, It's really important to have the perspective of the end user. If you're not experienced with it and you're writing the document, you should seek somebody out who's going to use that procedure at the end and say, hey, can you take a look at this for me? So you're ready to write the procedure, right? You've been given this list. You're going to go sit down at your desk and start writing away. So you're sitting there, starting to write the procedures for every subject discussed in regulations and standards. So again, that's one of those things that we do. We write a procedure for every single thing. And it looks a little bit like this. So that's kind of what the outcome would look like. Nice formatted document. The first step in writing an effective procedure is understanding why you are writing the procedure. Before you put your fingers to the keyboard, you need to understand why. So what do? Put the procedure template away for now. You've got some homework to do. So you do need to understand why. Procedures should be functional tools, just like a piece of equipment. They shouldn't just be an administrative effort to list steps in there. They should be functional so that you can actually use them while you're operating or maintaining the equipment. They should be process driven, not subject driven, not driven by some external, internal regulatory requirement or audit finding, but because you need them associated with a specific process that you have. If you do that, then you'll find that the number of procedures that you have for specific functions will probably be lower, and you'll actually create a purposeful flow between procedures and their relationships. So here's some examples. CAPAs, non-conforming materials, deviation management, they're all related. And the procedure is basically is certainly not the endpoint. The endpoint is having a complete documentation process that provides the proper level of knowledge and knowledge management and process control throughout the product lifecycle. So here's an example of a good way to map out what procedures you need. So understanding the relationships between the processes and the procedures. So on the left-hand side, you have processes, aseptic setup, VHP cycle, glove testing. Those are all processes that need to be performed. With each of those processes, you have different tasks. You have, with those tasks, potentially different SOPs. You need to figure out how long it's going to take you to perform each of those, and then who's affected by it, who actually has to do that work. Might be associated with a batch record, and then critical times. What this does is allows you to map out the procedures and help you identify any gaps you may have. You may see overlapping procedures between these different, and most likely will, between these different processes. So instead of having 3 procedures out there that tell you how to do the same thing, and then at some point you find out that they all end up in diverging directions, so they contradict each other. If you do this, you can actually take a look at what you need to have for procedures and minimize that list. And there's a huge effort in the industry in the last couple of years that I've seen to reduce the number of procedures that they have, reduce the training requirements that they have, which are driven by those procedures. And a lot of that is driven by overlapping documents that don't need to overlap. Process to procedure alignment is important. This is just an example of one tool that we've used. Again, this will be in the slide deck, so if you want to take a look at it afterwards or create something of your own like that, or even talk to me a little bit about it later on, I certainly am willing to help there. Okay, so several approaches to writing procedures. First of all, a little bit about procedure hierarchy. This is the typical, and it's very simplified, right? So there's certainly much more detail we can dive into here, but policies are like the high level governing document. And out of policies, you can get guidelines, which is not listed here, but you can get guidelines. You can get some other documents that lead you to writing procedures. The procedures are the SOPs. And SOPs drive you down to work instructions and job plans. not sure most of you are familiar with job plans. Basically, it's a type of work instruction that you get out of your maintenance management system for performing, say, pump rebuilds. It gives you the details for that. You could have one procedure to basically rule over all of them, but what happens there? That procedure grows to be that 100-page document we talked about earlier. I was with a client 3 months ago as we were starting a project there, and someone who was working with a team there brought out one of their procedures for me to look at. I said, "You got to see this." I'm like, "Okay." It's 125 pages long. I'm like, "No way." And I went through it and I'm like, "Wow, really? How are we going to follow that?" So there is that approach. It's not one that I would recommend. Or you could have one SOP for each task, and then you end up with individual SOPs for everything. So somewhere in there, there's a hybrid that is being used these days. Typically, I do see the policies. I do see procedures and SOPs being written at a much higher level these days, and the breakout of work instructions to define the task. So the people who are working on the floor, who are doing the maintenance, who are maintaining the facility, they're looking more at work instructions on how to perform the task associated with their job. That seems to be the best practice I see today. So some simple user requirements for an SOP, right? Got to have clear steps. Has to be easy to read. So that's not just a grammar or spell check or language type thing. The document, it has to be easy to read. If everything's cluttered, you got giant paragraphs stuff put together where you can't see the individual steps that are required, that's not considered easy to read. It has to be easy to follow, so it has to be in a logical sequence. It has to follow the process as it should be. It has to be easy to follow. In simple language. I love my boss, and some of you have heard him present before, and Harry and I work really well together, and I wish he was here to listen to this today. He and I have a different approach to things. He likes to use bigger, longer words to explain things, which is good in certain situations. And I'm kind of hopefully I convey that as I'm talking about this today, I'm kind of a direct, down-to-earth, plain English type of guy. Because I think if you write, particularly in procedures, if you write it in plain and simple English, people can follow it. If you start putting in extra terms that don't belong, extra descriptions, adjectives, things like that don't belong, people get lost in the procedure. This is a very important step. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the step before wasn't very important? No. And this one here, actually, so being in the industry as long as I have, pictures and diagrams, I remember back in my younger days when I worked for it was like one of the number 1 or number 2 biotechs in the country. And we were writing procedures, but we couldn't put pictures or diagrams in them because they had no way to store documents that were that size. The world's changed a lot since then. Matter of fact, most of the procedures I see now have pictures and diagrams. And it's really simple. This really smart guy made this statement a long time ago. One picture is worth 1,000 words. So how do we write procedures? Got to make sure we understand what the expectations are for the procedure we're writing. Make sure we get all our source documents. Functional specs, OEM manuals, or OQ, again, brains of the user, so the end users, subject matter experts, engineering turnover practice packages, whatever you need to have the information necessary to put in that procedure. It's a lot of work, but it's necessary work. What you don't want to do is find yourself doing a cut and paste from some other procedure where you haven't done all this work because it looks the same. And then turn out when they actually get it out there and it's issued, now guess what you're doing right away? You're revising the document because it's wrong. Make sure that the scope in the procedure equals the task that you're performing. The scope should state that. If it's really tied to a single building, it's tied to a single piece of equipment, and it's just tied to a process with that piece of equipment, that may be what you need to have in there. Or, typically you'll see an SOP that has, for a piece of equipment that has setup, startup, operations, abnormal operations, shutdown, and then it'll have some other task at the end. One of the common things I see there is people like to put maintenance in those procedures. Maintenance is typically covered in a different system, so it may not belong in there. Map out the process. Before you actually get into writing the procedure, somewhere that procedure should be mapped out in a visual format so that you can see it in Visio. We like to use a tool now called Miro. Doesn't matter how you use it, what tool you use, it can be Excel spreadsheet, but make sure the process is mapped out. That way, when you go to read the procedure, it will become clear to you if you've missed any steps. Write the steps. Make sure they're covered. So what should an SOP consist of? So I'm going to give you kind of a high-level view here, and then I've got another template we're going to walk through, and you can see, what that would really look like in real life with the template that we've created. So our company uses this. We've shared this with other people. At the end of this presentation, that template will be available to you. It's not proprietary. It's just an example of how we do things. So thank you, Lisa. So the first thing is a purpose. So what's the procedure for? Who does it serve? Why are you writing that document? That needs to be stated. This is the scope where we talked about this. Most equipment or systems are pretty big. If you're going to write a procedure for the entire upstream or downstream process or media prep, or you're going to write it for operating utilities, and you're going to try to include things like WFI, it could be a monster procedure. Even just if you pick one system, it's pretty large. So make sure you specify what you want to have in that procedure. That should be spelled out in that scope. And then as you go through it, you're spelling out the specific steps that need to be performed. And I like the word here, action verb. You really should include in there what the action verb is for that step. Start up, operate, perform. You need to be very concise in the language you use. If you leave the operator or the user guessing, they're going to put their own word in there. And then put in supporting information, tables, drawings, whatever's necessary to make the task clear. So don't put them at the end, put them in there with the associated task that's listed. If a task tells you to remove this gasket, put a picture in there of what that would look like. And if it tells you to install a gasket, put a picture in there and make sure you show what installing a gasket looks like from a proper installation. All right, so use a good template. So I'm going to try to go through this. I don't know if I'm going to actually get through all the steps in it. There are 6 pages to the template we have here. Again, this template will be available to you guys to use if you want. After the presentation's over, it'll come to you in the form of a Word document so you can edit it. But this is just a very generic template. So again, we talked about the purpose, and it's good to have a template like this that you can provide those people writing the SOPs so they can read it and say, oh, and the purpose, I have to indicate the purpose of this SOP, write a brief description of what the SOP will contain and what it will achieve. So I'm not going to read every one of those to you, but that's what you need to have in there. Purpose, scope, any definitions. If you write an acronym in the SOP, somewhere on this list, somewhere in here, there should be a list of those acronyms. So somebody's not guessing what that means. If there's a term in there and people don't know exactly what it means, or it's not a very common term, you need to define it. This is a good place to put all of that. And then responsibilities. This one's been tricky for me in the past with some people because in the training world where I work as well, people look at this and they say, well, if their name is on this responsibilities list, they need to read this SOP. You should ask yourself, is that a true statement or not a true statement? Are they reading the SOP and are they on this list just so that they can be informed the fact that this is out there, or do they actually perform tasks in here? So responsibility should be who's responsible for the SOP and who's responsible for performing that work. Any equipment or materials, safety is huge. You should have safety in every SOP. I almost went and said maybe marked NA where safety should never be marked NA. but there are some cases where that may be the case. And then defining whether this is actually a procedure or a policy. Use tables, and most certainly use references. If this is associated with a higher level SOP, we'll probably want to have the reference here. Higher level policy number, probably want to have the reference here. There has to be some type of, like they say in the instrument world, traceability with the document, right? So these are controlled documents. So with every revision, it's important that you include what was changed in the procedure. And sometimes I've seen this where they put in revision 1 and they just say updated procedure. What did that tell me? Nothing. So make sure you use this in an effective way. And then there's the whole process, the whole approval process. Somebody wrote it, so the author has to be in there with who he is, because name is pretty simple. Title is, okay, this person has a title associated with this procedure. Probably makes sense that's the right person to write it. And then you have reviewers, and obviously that could be one reviewer, that could be multiple reviewers, depending on how many people this affects. And then you have an approver. It's a good idea at the bottom to have kind of a signature log so everybody knows who they are. And then any other specific information that might be useful in the procedure. I didn't mention the attachments, but again, if you're going to put attachments in here, they should be numbered and sequenced and captured here. Here's some examples of some attachments. You can use either one. Again, these are examples for you guys to use if you want. And then our company uses this checklist. I probably should have taken the logo out, but this is what we use. And again, you can use it. And it takes you through after you've written the procedure or while you're writing a procedure. Make sure that you got everything in there you need to have. It's a good idea to have the checklist to start with. Look at it before you start writing it, and then go back and look at it afterwards. It does have some really important information in here, like how you're supposed to save the document, track the versions, making sure you use the right text, read through the document and check for complete sentences. I'm a bullet type guy, so sometimes that catches me off guard. Verify that the verb tenses, let me read that one, I like that one. Verify that the verb tenses and voice are consistent throughout the document. And gotta capture all the acronyms. This is just standard technical writing type stuff, right? So the first time you mention an acronym, you need to spell it out. After that, you can just use it. This is a really good checklist. So it gets you through the author, what they should be doing, takes you through the reviewer and what they should be doing. And then if there's any type of clone, so this is where you can get into trouble, is if you have similar documents, you're going to try to copy them and use them for the same purpose. Just have to make sure that they have all accurate information specific to whatever piece of equipment or system you're writing it for. And then somebody signs it at the end. So what don't we want to include in an SOP or a procedure? I've said this a million times, I'll say it again. Anything that is not specific to the task being performed. This next one is kind of one of my favorite ones. The SOP is not a training document, it's a procedure. So if you're going to put training, you should, in my opinion, you shouldn't be putting training requirements in the SOP. The fact that people work in our industry, they should already know that they need training, but that should be covered somewhere else. Having a statement that says training must be, or training is required, that's a non-value added statement. And while it's certainly important to have the, part of a training process, the SOP is not the training document. Before an operator actually gets on the floor, they should have read that SOP and they should have received some type of training associated with the work in that SOP. The SOP is not the place for a knowledge transfer to take place. The SOP should be scannable and easy to read. And this is what I mentioned earlier. It's a set of instructions that describes all the relevant steps and activities for a process or procedure. Anything above that is fluff and gets in the way of the person who's reading it ability to follow it. So here are some other considerations when you're writing SOPs, and Lisa's going to talk to these points. These are supporting components to writing an SOP. So Lisa, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. So one of the things that I just want to spend a little time on today is kind of to reiterate some statements that Jeff's made, but also to build on that a little bit. I've spent over 35 years of my adult life primarily writing procedures. And yes, Jeff was right. I pick on him for not mentioning quality, and that's because in most of the organizations in which I have worked, I have ended up, in fact, having to write almost all of the procedures in many cases, whether it was an area of my specialty or not, because people just threw up hands and didn't get them done. And I think some of the reason for that tends to be because they don't in fact know what to write, how it should be written. And so I think a lot of education in these type of areas can be very important. In the past several years, I have started to throw away everything I've done for, let's say, before that and how to write a procedure. I will admit, I have written especially a quality management system based, well, the FDA says you should have a procedure for complaint management. The FDA says you should have a procedure for this. The FDA says you should have a procedure for this, and acknowledge the fact that I'm not writing procedures for the FDA. The FDA is not coming into my building and using my procedures for anything. I will use them when I go to justify what we do to the FDA, if that is the case, if they're in asking for that. But I'm writing procedures for the people who are in the building and need to use those procedures to be able to function, to be able to build a quality of culture, to be able to be consistent, and not have people, we've mentioned, you give someone a 100-page procedure, they're going to pocket veto that procedure. They're going to say, I can't follow this. I've been here 20 years. I know how to do this. I'm going to do it the way I know is right. So the things I want to make sure that we become more aware of in writing procedures, and really it's one of the reasons we made the statement to step away from the computer for a moment, is one of the diagrams that Jeff showed, it was a matrix where you actually flow out your various processes. And one of the interesting areas that I find we do not do this enough is our quality system and our quality management requirements, and how they act with everything else that we are doing in the building, as well as stand on their own. I think for too long we've written quality systems because we have to write it, and we write it as a unit, say 23 procedures are our QMS, and this is, and we're really not integrating it. One of the things that I have recently begun doing in my processes is to look at some of the overall elements that should be guiding the decisions that we are making in our organizations beyond just FDA says we have to do it. And so those elements generally are coming right now. I'm using here as an example, as you can see, are ICH Q10, pharmaceutical quality systems. Personally, I also work in medical device. I think the concepts of Q10 obviously are very transferable to medical device beyond being pharmaceutical. And so the elements that I have tried to start incorporating, even before I start sitting down and writing a quality management system, is to understand the flow of how that quality management system needs to interact with all of the other systems in the plant when it comes to things like knowledge management. The overall goal of writing a procedure is to enhance the knowledge management in your organization, not to, and I will say this because I'm in quality, so I can talk bad about quality. A lot of quality organizations, for example, do what I call ivory tower quality. And that's where they sit up in their ivory towers and they write procedures because they know how to write a procedure that FDA will like, and they toss them out over the edge of their tower and expect everyone else to follow them when they have nothing to do with anything else everyone else is doing and they're not integrated. So we need to acknowledge that part of every set of procedures that we are writing have to integrate in our overall knowledge management function within our organization. Risk management. We all know that risk management is still an area where FDA continues to cite organizations over and over for not even understanding the concept of risk management. I still often go into organizations and find that, yeah, they are doing a couple of risk assessments, but they haven't considered risk management. An example of that is a project that I just completed. We were asked by an organization to come in and do an integrated risk management program for them. It was something I had mentioned to them in audit findings and something that their customers had mentioned to them in audit findings that was not as robust as it could have been. I did not go in and write a risk management procedure and hand it to them and say, here, we're done. What we did and did what I'm talking about here, where we really looked at risk management, we looked at their processes, we looked at their resources. Resources is also very important. You cannot write a procedure, and I find companies falling into this, that assume that you have 95 silos and 27 people in each silo. I currently have a client who has 3 part-time employees. The systems and the procedures that I write for them cannot be the same as the system or procedure that I would write for an organization that is a facility with over 700 people in it, and yet I still have to accomplish the same things. I still have to show that I'm controlling change and risk and knowledge management and all of these other activities that are critical to ensure that we are performing them, but I can't do it in the same way. And so each company needs to take that into consideration and say, look, I can go out on the internet and I can Google good change management procedure example. And people bring those in and they just take them and they plunk their company name in it and they put it out there, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's not been part and parcel of an entire integration of your procedural process across the organization. Risk management that applies in this recent example that I'm giving you is we did write risk management procedures. We wrote 3 of them. We wrote a policy. We wrote an overall risk management procedure on when it must be done, the level of risk management required at different stages of concern, and we wrote them a procedure on risk management tools and how to use them. But the other thing we ended up doing at the end of the day is taking 44 of their existing procedures and modifying those procedures to truly integrate risk management. So again, when you are developing a procedural process, you cannot put the blinders on and say, I need to write a procedure for risk management, and I'm going to get this procedure done, and I'm going to put it in the system, and it's going to be effective, and we're going to be good. You have to expand the scope of your vision to understand that risk management is just that. It is an entire management process that needs to be fully folded into and integrated into all of the processes that you're performing in the organization. If you do not tie them all in properly by doing, for example, that type of matrix that Jeff showed, or I will sometimes do using different types of flow charts. I find, if you use spaghetti diagrams or use any kind of a diagram, it might not be officially the way you use that diagram, but if it's something a little more fun to work with, I can get a lot more engagement with my clients on getting people to put things in and move things around and do some things like that. And again, change management is really part and parcel of the same thing, right? We have change in a lot of the things we do on a very regular basis. But if all we're doing is writing a change management procedure in and of itself that contains those things that when I go on and I read, okay, what are the FDA 483 sightings? What are they saying is wrong with people's change management procedures? And then I write steps, 1 to 25. Good, I've captured everything that FDA said was missing on everybody else's change management procedures. I'm good. You're not. You haven't taken that idea of that procedure and blown it out into the entirety of the way change management needs to work within your organization. So if you take the time to do these high level looks, and you don't have to always do this proactively, this isn't just for a brand new procedural system. This can be done as part of a remediation plan. If you've got some audit findings, just continuous improvement. It could be a great project for continuous improvement. Personally, I hate document proliferation. I once went to work for an organization with over 2,800 controlled documents. It meant that we had 3 controlled documents for every person in the building, individually, just by numbers, which obviously, not only a large document, but many documents. So if I have to go to 4 documents to find how it is I'm supposed to do something, one, I may very well miss one of them because I'm going to assume, hey, everything I need to do about change management is in my change management procedures and processes. And you can find something somewhere else that it doesn't belong. So back to what Jeff said, make sure you're including what you need to include and reference out to another procedure. Don't duplicate information from one procedure into another procedure. They'll stop talking to each other. So really at the end of the day, that was kind of the messaging, you know, that I'm just trying to get across there on making sure you're integrating everything and not just doing things kind of reminders on or in a silo. So that being said, we are getting close to our time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and of course, we always want to throw it over to some question time. So I'm going to throw it back to everyone else here in terms of presenting and see if we have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. And so, again, we talked mostly about writing a procedure, but these are all important components to having a good documentation system for writing a procedure. So just want to recap really quickly before we get to the questions. So we talked about how the SOPs are our #1 observation over the last, I think I said 15 years in the slide, but if you really go back, there's 20 years at least of data. We talked about who should write SOPs. The first step in writing an SOP is defining and understanding the process or processes, and then other considerations in writing an SOP and systems that support that. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you guys with the questions, and Lisa and I will answer as many questions as we can.
Well, thank you, Jeff and Lisa. Thanks so much for an amazing presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A. And we're going to give a few minutes for people to think of any questions that they might have. We'll just pause a few moments. I see some questions. I see one question: how to distinguish between SOP and WI?
That's a good question, and we see a lot of that. So when you get to the point where you're talking about SOPs and work instructions, as much as I hate to say it, the SOP kind of starts looking more like a policy than an SOP, but it still has specific steps in there, like say you have an SOP on a bioreactor, and in that SOP, it has different steps associated with the bioreactor, where I mentioned earlier, the startup, the operations, the shutdown. The work instruction will give you the details typically associated with one of those, not all of those. So the work instruction drills down to the details necessary typically for one person to perform that task, or one area to perform that task. And it's associated with something in the SOP, but not the entire SOP. So I hope that answers your question.
And if I can throw an analogy, and I'm sorry, I'm just someone who uses analogies a lot, helpful. I personally am a cook, and for me, kind of relating to something you might do in real life, day-to-day stuff, is I like to read about how to cook, the fundamentals of cooking, this technique, how to do that technique. But that's not telling me how to apply that technique on this specific dish. That would be the recipe. So the recipe that I follow step by step by step by step in order, exactly as it says, to create something is a work instruction, whereas my general reading that I do about techniques and foundational information is an SOP.
Great, thank you. We'll give a few more minutes just to see if anybody else has any questions. And once again, if there are questions that come to mind later, we'll definitely send them over to Jeff or Lisa, or you can directly send them to them as well. So I have another question here. Let me see. I believe this is saying, can people then deviate against a WI or just an SOP? I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, so you can read that one again.
Can people then deviate against the WI or just an SOP?
So my understanding is to say, can you, does a deviation have to be written against the SOP or the WI?
Deviate against the WI or just an SOP?
Oh, they can deviate against the WI for sure. Again, a work instruction is still another form of a controlled document. So, and if you're asking if it's okay to deviate, obviously the answer is no.
I also had one other comment here. So could you provide a bit more explanation of SOP versus WI? There's more elaboration possible.
I think Lisa did a good job of giving an example there, but the SOP is still about the tasks that are required to operate a piece of equipment, a system, follow a process.
Yep.
The work instruction takes one of those processes or one of those tasks that's listed in that SOP and breaks it out to these specific steps required to do that.
Okay.
So another example of that might be more real life here and practical is think of work instruction as something like an individual batch record, right? So have a general procedure that tells you here's the care and feed particular piece of equipment. This is generally how to run it, how to set it up. But the batch record for that specific product will give you for this product, follow your SOP on how to do a setup, but use these specific parameters for this product to run. So you have an SOP that tells you here's how to set a temperature on this piece of equipment, but the work instruction, in case the batch record being your work instruction level document, says these are the temperatures we need. So hopefully it's a little more day-to-day type of description.
I see about 2 more questions. What are examples of exercises that can help audit if an existing SOP system and its SOPs are aligning?
Lisa,
Best
you
thing
wanna-
to do, the easiest thing is to get people who do not follow these SOPs every day, give them to those and send them out to try to follow the SOP. Now, obviously not operating a piece of equipment, safety issues, training and all of that. But in general, if you have someone who say is a warehouse technician who would never normally have the responsibility to have to write a deviation, let's use our deviations there, give them a procedure and have them try to write a deviation, because the procedure should be written such that anyone coming in off the street with minimal instructions should be able to follow it. Someone within your organization who has at least a lot of knowledge about your organization, your processes and how they work, it should be even easier. So take someone who would never normally follow that procedure and have them try to follow it.
Okay, and then I think one more final one. Would you separate SOPs based on roles, example, admin and operator?
Right, sorry, can you say that again one more time?
Would you separate SOPs based on roles, example, admin and operator?
Well, again, it's the SOPs are written specific to the process that you're following. And I have seen, and Lisa, you can probably say the same thing. I have seen where there are a separate SOP for the administrative actions associated with the process. But if if that administrative component is part of performing the task, then it should be captured in the SOP. And then maybe you have a work instruction that breaks out the task part of it. Hopefully that answered your question.
All right, well, I think we're gonna wrap up here. Once again, thank you, Jeff and Lisa, for the presentation. Everyone, please make sure to look out for an email. Well, we at Connex would like to thank everyone for attending today's Developing Effective Procedures webinar. Please make sure to look out for an email after the webinar containing the slides as well as information to register for our next webinar. Those who have attended will also receive special rates to our upcoming biopharmaceutical manufacturing conference in November, as well as our CSV and SA conference in December. Any questions that we did not get to today, we will forward to Jeff and Lisa, and please keep an eye out for a follow-up email from us for these questions and other materials. Once again, Jeff and Lisa, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We will forward you any questions that we come through for us, and we'll send them to you. And everyone, you can also directly send to Jeff and Lisa.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for attending.
Once again, thank you.
Thanks everyone very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.